A moonless night on Mount Taygetus. The air is thin, cold enough to scorch the lungs with each breath. Nothing here offers comfort. Only the bite of pine resin and the dry scrape of olive leaves, stirred by a wind no one can feel. Crickets saw at the darkness without pause, a sound so relentless it curdles into a kind of silence. Against this, a boy lies flat on the packed earth. A rock ridge digs into his ribs. He does not move. 16, maybe 17, but his eyes belong to someone far older. His knuckles have gone pale around the leather grip of a short iron blade. His breath escapes in a thin cloud, and he holds it back, afraid the fog will give him away. He is not hunting a wolf. He is not hunting a boar. The knot in his shoulders is meant for a man. He is listening, waiting for a specific sound on the path below. The heavy, even tread of a farmer walking home to his children. The tired shuffle of a slave dragging himself back to the barracks after a day of splitting stone. A man who does not know his life is now counted in footsteps. This is not a killing born of rage, not the work of a bandit driven by hunger. This is a test. Pass it, or stop mattering. This is the Krypteia. In the old tongue, the words mean the hidden thing, and it was the final act of Sparta's state upbringing, the Agoge. For years, that system starved this boy, beat him, and drilled one lesson into him. Mercy is a flaw. Now it demands proof he learned it. He did not steal the blade. A magistrate handed it to him. They stripped away the red cloak that marked him as a Spartan youth. They sent him into the hills with one order: find the strongest of the Helots, the conquered people who work Spartan land, the ones who stand tall, the ones who hold your gaze without flinching. Kill them, and do not be caught. If you are, the state will deny you ever existed. You will be punished, not for the killing, but for being careless enough to be seen. How does a civilization sign off on murder? How does a state hand a child a knife, point him at an unarmed man in the dark, and call it a public service? The answer is not brute force. It is a legal trick so cold it borders on brilliance. Plutarch, writing much later, drew on a lost work by Aristotle on the Spartan constitution. Every autumn, 5 men held the real power in Sparta, the Ephors, and each autumn they performed a quiet ritual. They stood before the gods and formally declared war on their own slaves. With that one sentence, everything shifted. The boy on the mountainside was no longer an assassin, he was a soldier. The blade in his fist was no longer a murder weapon. It was a tool of state defense. The man on the path was no longer a neighbor, a worker, a father. He was an enemy, in a war he never knew had begun. And the scream that would soon tear across the valley was not a crime. It was one more casualty in a war with no battles, no banners, and no end. Tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. We read every single one. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, take a second to subscribe and support the project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The man on the mountain path is no stranger. He was not dragged from some distant land in chains and sold at a Spartan market. His grandfather's bones lie in the same fields. He now breaks his back to plow for another man's table. He is a Messenian, and that word carries a wound. Generations before him, his people were Greeks, like any other. They lived free in the rich valleys west of the Taygetus range, along the slow brown river the Greeks called the Pomissus, where the wheat grew taller than in stony Laconia. They crowned their own kings. They kept their own customs. They walked with the straight backs of men who owned the ground beneath their feet. Then the Spartans crossed the mountains. The first war came in the late 8th century B.C. Pausanias, the traveler who walked these lands centuries later and wrote down what the locals still remembered, says it dragged on for 19 years. It ended on the slopes of Mount Taygetus, where the last Messenian king, Aristodemus, held out until the omens turned against him and he cut his own throat over his daughter's grave. The second war came a lifetime later, in the 7th century B.C., and it gave Messenia a hero named Aristomenes, a man Pausanias describes leaping over walls and raiding into Laconia by night. He too lost. Twice Sparta ground Messenia down. The second time they swallowed it whole. But they did not stop at conquest. Other Greek cities beat their enemies, took tribute, and moved on. Sparta did something no one had done before. They enslaved an entire people on the very land that had been theirs. A whole nation chained to its own soil. They gave them a new name, Helots. Understand what this was, because it was not the slavery you might picture. It was not one man buying another at auction. A single body owned by a single master. This was a captive population, bound to the earth, their bodies and their harvests treated as the property of the Spartan state itself. They did not belong to a person. They belonged to a machine. The poet Krypteia lived through the second of these wars, and he was a Spartan, so he felt no need to soften it. He wrote that the Helots were worked like asses worn down under heavy loads. Half of everything they grew was carried off to their masters in Sparta. Half their bread, half their oil, half of every season of labor, taken before they could feed their own children. And their grief belonged to Sparta too. When a Spartan king died, when a magistrate was carried to his grave, the Helots were marched to the funeral and made to mourn. They wept, they tore at themselves, they wailed for the men who owned them. Even their sorrow was a resource to be pumped from their bodies on command. There was no corner of a Helot's life that Sparta did not reach into and take. This built something no other Greek city had to live with. A number, quietly growing under the floorboards of the whole society. A bomb with no fuse anyone could see. The exact figures are gone. But Herodotus, who walked that world and spoke to men who knew it, gives us a moment where the ratio shows itself. He describes the Spartans at the Battle of Plataea in 479 B.C. 5,000 Spartan citizens marched out, and with them went 35,000 Helots, 7 light-armed attendants for every single hoplite, 7 to 1. There, on the plain of Boeotia, the arithmetic of the whole society stood exposed in the open field. Sit with that ratio. It means that inside a Spartan house, the Helots who kneaded the dough and washed the children and swept the floors outnumbered the family they served. It means that on a country estate, the laborers in the fields outnumbered the lone Spartan, watching them by 7 to 1. It means every road, every temple step, every stall in every market was crowded with the quiet presence of a people who hated their masters and outnumbered them many times over. Sparta did not have a slave problem. Sparta was a slave state, a small armed camp of masters, living in the middle of an enormous prison, surrounded on every side by the people they had crushed. The Spartans liked to call themselves lords of a kingdom. They were nothing of the kind. They were jailers standing on a tiny island of power, and the water around them was hate, and it was rising. This shaped every hour of a Spartan's life, every law they wrote, every alliance they sealed, every war they waged marching off to fight. Behind all of it sat one question that never let them rest. What happens if the Helots rise while the army is on the other side of Greece? Thucydides caught them in the act of that fear. He records that during the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans announced they would free any Helot who had proven himself in battle. 2,000 came forward, the boldest and best of them. They were crowned with garlands and led around the temples like free men. Then they vanished, every one of them. Thucydides says no one ever learned how each had died. Sparta had drawn out its most dangerous men by offering them hope, and then quietly erased them. That was how the state slept at night. Because the fear was not a nightmare they imagined, it was a memory they carried. In 400 BC, the fear walked out of their dreams and into daylight. The ground itself turned on Sparta. An earthquake tore through the Laconian valley, one of the deadliest the ancient world recorded. The land heaved and cracked open. Plutarch says peaks split off from the Taygetus range and crashed down the slopes. Walls came down in clouds of dust and shattered stone. When it was over, he writes, only 5 houses in all of Sparta still stood. Thousands died in a single afternoon. Men and women crushed where they slept, buried under the roofs of their homes, their training grounds, their temples. Plutarch preserves one image from that day that shows exactly what kind of city this was. A group of young Spartans had been exercising indoors when the shaking began. The building started to come apart above them. King Archidamus, seeing what was coming, understood in an instant that the state's future lay in those boys. He shouted for them to grab their weapons and run outside. They obeyed. They cleared the doorway, seconds before the roof fell in behind them. In the space of a few violent minutes, the ruling class of Sparta was gutted. The city lay broken. The survivors stumbled through the rubble, stunned, and out in the fields, the Helots understood what the tremor meant. They rose from the quarries and the vineyards, and the wheat rows they came, snatching up scythes and picks, seizing whatever weapons they could find, arming themselves with the tools of their own bondage. They turned toward the ruins of Sparta with one purpose: finish what the earthquake had started. Diodorus Siculus writes that the Helots first moved to storm the city itself, thinking it undefended. Archidamus met them not behind walls, because the walls were gone, but with a line of spears drawn up in the open where the streets had been. The sight of ordered Spartan hoplites, even a handful of them, made the Helots hesitate. They pulled back to the countryside, and there the war spread. It did not end in a day or a season. It burned for the better part of a decade. The Helots were joined by the Perioikoi, the free but subject people of the region, and 2 whole towns of them, Thoria and Aethaia, went over to the revolt. At the height of it, the rebels seized Mount Idhome, the old spiritual heart of Messenia, the same peak where their king had died 3 centuries before. From that height, they defied everything Sparta had left to throw at them. The greatest land army in Greece could not pry them loose, so Sparta swallowed its pride and sent to Athens for help, because the Athenians had a reputation for cracking open fortified places. Cimon, the great Athenian general and a friend to Sparta, personally argued in the assembly for sending aid and marched south with 4,000 hoplites. But when they arrived beneath Idhome and failed to break it, the Spartans grew suddenly afraid of their own allies. Thucydides says they feared the Athenians, seeing free men and clever ones might change sides and join the Helots. So they dismissed them, sent them home alone, insulted, while every other ally stayed. That insult broke the friendship between the 2 cities and helped set Greece on the road to the great war that would come. The revolt on Idhome had reached out and cracked the whole balance of the Greek world. For a moment, One long, agonized moment, Sparta stood at the edge of vanishing, not conquered by a foreign king, nearly destroyed by the men and women whose labor it had been eating for 200 years. They never let go of that memory. The great revolt of 464 BC became the wound at the center of everything Sparta was. Every choice they made afterward was made to be sure it never happened again. Out of that terror, Sparta remade itself, harder, colder. Every thread of the society was pulled tight and re-knotted with a single aim: never again. That is where the Agoge comes from. The state training that took a Spartan boy at 7 years old, tore him from his mother's house, and set about dismantling him piece by piece so the state could rebuild him into a part it could use. And here is the thing most people miss about it. The Agoge was not built simply to make soldiers. Any city could make soldiers. It was built to make masters. It was a factory with one product, men capable of holding down a captive nation for a lifetime. So the boys were kept hungry, always hungry, fed just enough to stay upright, never enough to feel full. Plutarch tells us they slept on beds, they made themselves from reeds, they tore up by hand from the banks of the Herodotus River. No knife allowed, just fingers ripping green stalks by the water's edge. In winter, they were permitted to mix a little thistledown into the reeds for warmth. That was the whole of their comfort. The hunger was designed to push them toward theft, to send them creeping through the dark after food that was not theirs. A boy caught stealing was flogged without mercy, but not for the stealing, for getting caught. Read that again, because it is the whole of Sparta in one rule. The crime was never the theft. The crime was the clumsiness of being seen. Plutarch keeps alive the story every Spartan boy grew up hearing. A boy had stolen a fox cub and hidden it beneath his cloak. Rather than be discovered, he stood in silence and let the animal tear open his belly with its teeth and claws, until he dropped dead where he stood, the cloak still closed over the wound. That was held up not as a horror but as a model. Endure anything. Reveal nothing. The lesson was stealth, cunning, silence, a cool disregard for another man's property. Exactly the instincts a ruling class needs when it lives off the fields of people it has enslaved. They were trained to swallow pain and keep their faces still. At the altar of Artemis Orthia, on the western bank of the Eurotas, boys were whipped in a rite the Spartans called the diamastigosis. The altar stood inside a sanctuary, and priestesses held a small ancient wooden image of the goddess through the whole ordeal. If the whipping slackened, the priestess complained the image grew heavy in her arms, and the lash came down harder. Boys competed to see who could take it longest without a single sound. Some had the skin stripped from their backs. Some died there on the stones beneath the altar. Centuries later, under Roman rule, this rite had become such a spectacle that tourists came to watch, and the Romans built a theater around the sanctuary so the crowds could see the blood. This was never really about bravery in a battle line. It was about cutting a wire in the mind, the wire that runs between pain and pity. A boy who could stand and watch his own friend flogged to a bloody ruin and not flinch grows into a man who can order a helot beaten over nothing and feel his own pulse stay level. That was the point. That was always the point. Every hardship in the Agoge shaved away another sliver of what made these boys human, until what remained was discipline, obedience, and a settled contempt for anyone weaker than themselves. The men who ran this machine were not the two kings whose names history remembers. The kings led armies and performed the rites. The real power, the quiet and frightening power, sat with the Ephors. There were 5 of them, chosen fresh each year from among the citizens. Aristotle, who studied the Spartan constitution closely, found the office strange and dangerous. He noted that any citizen could be elected, even a poor man, and that once in office the 5 could sit in judgment over kings. When they entered their term, each Ephor issued a public proclamation to all Spartans. Plutarch preserves its opening command. "Shave your mustaches," it said, "and obey the laws." A small order, almost absurd, but it was the state reminding every man that even the hair on his lip belonged to the law. The Ephors could put a king on trial. They steered Sparta's dealings with the outside world. And above all, they held the internal security of the state in their hands. They were the true masters of the Agoge, the shadowed figures who made certain the machine kept turning out the men Sparta needed. And it was these 5 who, every autumn, stepped forward and performed the ritual that made the Krypteia possible. They declared war, formally and before the gods, on their own slaves. Plutarch, drawing on the lost work Aristotle wrote about the Spartan constitution, records it plainly, so that killing a Helot could never bring the stain of blood guilt onto the state. The Ephors declared war on them the moment they took office, each and every year. It sounds like a technicality. It was anything but. It was a piece of psychological engineering as precise as any weapon they forged. Because with war declared, a Spartan who killed a Helot was not a murderer acting on his own cruelty. He was a soldier carrying out an act of war. The knife in the dark stopped being a crime and became state policy, clean and impersonal. The Ephors were the high priests of Spartan fear, and their yearly declaration was a sacrament that scrubbed the blood from young hands before those hands had spilled a single drop. They had grasped something ruthless and true. To control the bodies of a great many people, you first have to shape the minds of the few who carry the whips. But the terror did not sleep between the autumn declarations. It ran every day, low and constant, a slow campaign to keep the Helots stumbling, uncertain, and always reminded of exactly what they were. Plutarch preserves the small, grinding rules built for that purpose. A Helot had to wear a cap of dogskin and a garment of animal hide, a marker that set him apart from every free man at a glance, a badge stitched from his own servitude. He could own no weapon, not a spear, not a proper blade, and he was beaten a set number of times each year, no matter what he had or had not done. Beaten simply so that, as the ancient sources put it, he would never forget he was a slave. Any Helot who grew too strong or too fit in body was punished, and his owner was fined for letting it happen. Strength itself in a Helot was a crime. The aim was not to punish acts. It was to punish the mere possibility of pride. The cruelest of these rituals wore the mask of a virtue lesson. Spartans prized self-control above nearly everything, and they wanted their sons to learn it. So they would take Helots and pour unmixed wine into them until they staggered. In a world where Greeks always cut their wine with water, drinking it neat was seen as the mark of a barbarian, a shortcut to madness. Then they would drag these drunken men into the messes, the common dining halls, where the young Spartans sat at their meal of black broth and bread. There the intoxicated slaves were made to bawl out filthy songs and lurch through clumsy, humiliating dances. The boys were told to watch and learn. See what wine does. See what it makes of a man. Stay sober, and you will never become that. But the true lesson was underneath, and it had nothing to do with wine. It taught the boys to look at a Helot and see not a man, but a thing, a prop, a living object whose degradation could be squeezed for a civic lesson. Night after night, the Helots were paraded as a spectacle of shame, until every Spartan child understood in his bones that these were a lower kind of creature. Barely a step above the beasts they drove through the fields. Plutarch, who loved Sparta enough to write 4 separate works about it, could not stomach this one. He called such treatment harsh and cruel, and he doubted the older, better Sparta had done it, guessing the worst of it came after the earthquake and the great revolt, when fear had eaten away whatever mercy the city once had. These mechanisms, this whole cold architecture of control, are not dusty footnotes to us. They are the reason ancestral exists. We believe that to understand the world you live in now, you have to be willing to stare straight into the worst that came before it, without blinking. If that is who you are, if you believe this kind of deep historical work matters, then I want you inside our inner circle. The lineage. When you become a member, you are not just backing a channel. You join a team committed to making the finest history documentaries on this platform, and you help make sure stories of power, fear, and survival like this one are never lost. You get early access to new films and other perks, but more than that, you become a patron of the mission itself. You keep the research alive and the lights on. If you feel that pull, tap the join button and become part of the family. The system left nothing to chance. Physical violence, daily humiliation, and legal fiction, all woven into a single web with one purpose: to keep the volcano from blowing its top. Sparta was a machine for grinding down the human spirit, and it ground down master and slave alike. The Agoge turned out boys who were hard, obedient, and empty of pity. The laws pressed an entire people into a permanent lower caste. The nightly rituals of shame were meant to smother any spark before it could ever catch. And still, it was not enough. Broad oppression can hold a crowd in place, but the Spartans had learned a harder truth on the slopes of Ithome in 460 BC. Revolutions do not begin with crowds, they begin with individuals. With the strong one, the proud one, the clever one who studies his masters and says nothing, the one who refuses to break no matter how many times they whip him, the Helot who grew too fit, the one the state fined his owner for raising, the one who carried himself like Aristomenes reborn. To reach that man, the state needed something sharper than a phalanx, something quieter. It needed a blade that could find a single throat in the dark. And so, the whole system bent toward producing one final thing, the perfect killer. But not every boy would be handed that knife. For the last and secret trial, the Ephors were hunting for a rarer quality in the ranks of their young men, something past discipline, something colder than obedience. They wanted the boy who felt nothing at all when the fox opened his belly, and the way they went looking for him would turn a schoolyard of children into a hunting ground and send the best of them up the black flank of Taygetus with a knife, and in order to prove he was no longer human. Not every boy who survived the Agoge was chosen for the last trial. The phalanx needed men who could stand in a line and hold it, disciplined, obedient, steady under a rain of spears. The Krypteia needed something else. It needed hunters. The Ephors were the ones who chose. Those 5 men watched the boys for years, and they were not only counting who ran fastest or endured the longest under the lash, they were watching for a turn of mind. They watched the boy who, told to steal his supper, did not simply snatch the nearest loaf. They watched the one who studied the kitchens for days, learned when the cook slept, and slipped in without a sound. In the mock battles, where the boys tore into each other with fists and clubs, they marked the youth who did not just swing hardest, but saw where his opponent was weak, and struck there without a flicker of hesitation. The boys fought some of these battles on an island in the Eurotas called Platanistas, a stand of plane trees ringed by water, reached by 2 bridges. Cicero, the Roman, heard of the place, and wrote that the young Spartans fought there with hands, feet, teeth, and nails, and would sooner die than admit defeat. On the night before, each team sacrificed a puppy to the war god and set fighting boars against each other, reading omens in which animal prevailed. The Ephors stood at the edge of that torn ground and watched who kept his head while everyone around him lost theirs. They wanted the quiet ones, the watchful ones, the boys who could sit alone for hours and seem to need no one. Intelligence honed to an edge, a mind that could work in the dark with no one giving it orders. This was not a prize for the finest soldier. This was recruitment into Sparta's secret service, its intelligence corps, its assassins. To be picked for the Krypteia was to be marked as one of the most promising young men in Sparta, and one of the most dangerous. Plato, who knew Sparta well and admired parts of it, mentions the Krypteia in his laws almost in passing, listing it among the hardships that toughened the young, walking barefoot in winter, sleeping without bedding, ranging the whole country by night and day. He set it beside these as if it were a fitness exercise. That was how the philosophers of Greece filed away a program of state murder, a rugged bit of schooling. Even Plato flinched from it, though. In the dialogue his characters break off, unsure whether the Krypteia should be praised or condemned, and change the subject. Once chosen, the ritual began, and it began in secret. The youths were brought before the Ephors, away from any crowd. There was no ceremony, no witnesses, no crowd chanting names. They were stripped of the red cloak that marked them as Spartan. They were handed one weapon, a short dagger, curved and cruel, small enough to vanish under a fold of cloth. They were given rations that would barely hold off starvation. Then they were sent out, alone, into the countryside that was, on paper, their own land, and was now, by decree, a war zone. The rules were few, and they were absolute. By day, be unseen. Sleep in the wild, in caves, in thickets thick enough to swallow a man. Under the arched roots of olive trees older than the city itself. Become nothing. Become a rumor moving through the hills. The land itself helped hide him. Laconia is a country of hard folds, ridges of gray limestone dropping into gorges, the Eurotas cutting its green line down the middle, and above it all the wall of Taygetus, snow on its highest teeth even in spring. A man could lie in a cleft of rock 100 paces from a farm and never be seen. The wild pears and the myrtle grew thick along the stream beds. The boy learned every one of these hides, the way a shepherd learns his own pastures. By daylight, the world belonged to the Helots. They filled the fields, bent over the wheat and the vines under a hard sun, and the young Spartan lay hidden, watching them like a fox watches a henhouse. He was the fugitive now. He hid from the light. He studied the men he would soon kill. He learned which one straightened his back to rest and looked toward the mountains a moment too long. He learned which one the others fell quiet around. When the sun dropped behind Taygetus, the world turned over. He crept from his hole. The roads, the scattered farmsteads, the lonely barns, all of it became his ground. He moved along the paths without sound, listening, waiting. The dry stone walls held the day's heat into the night, and he pressed his back to them and let the dark come. He was there to kill. Consider what this did to a boy's mind. For 10 years, the Agoge had defined him entirely by the group. He ate in a mess with his unit. He slept packed among his peers on beds of torn reeds. He fought in a pack, bled in a pack, was punished as a pack. His self had been dissolved into the whole. The unit was everything. Now there was no unit. There was only him. The clatter of the barracks was gone, replaced by the cry of a wolf somewhere across the valley, and the endless scratching of insects in the dark. The shared warmth of 40 bodies was gone, replaced by cold that settled into the joints and stayed there through the night. He was alone, half-starved, and every moment awake with the fear of being found. A snapped twig could end him. A footprint pressed into soft ground beside a spring could betray where he slept. And discovery did not mean a scolding. If a group of Helots cornered him, unarmed men though they were, there were many of them, and one of him, and they hated him with generations of stored hate. The hunter could become the meat. That fear was not a flaw in the plan. It was the plan. The solitude and the dread burned away the last of his boyhood need for other people. It taught him to trust nothing but his own ears, his own reasoning, his own knife. In that furnace of loneliness, the boy who had only ever been part of a pack was reforged into a creature that could kill alone. And the killing itself, when it finally came, was the proof of the change. It was the moment he stopped being one shield in a wall and became a weapon that needed no one. But this was never mindless slaughter. The Krypteia did not turn boys loose to cut down whoever crossed their path. It was a program of targeted murder, and its precision is exactly what makes it so cold. Plutarch, again drawing on the lost book Aristotle wrote about Sparta, is direct about the orders. The young men of the Krypteia were to seek out the strongest of the Helots, the most spirited, the most respected. He adds a second detail that is worse than the first. Some of the Krypteia, he says, worked in daylight too. They spread out across the roads, and if a Helot who looked strong or dangerous passed by, they cut him down where he stood, in the open, and walked on. The boy waiting beside the path was not there for any farmer at all. He was there for one particular man, the one the others followed, the one who worked harder than the rest and carried it lightly, the one who stood a fraction straighter than a slave should stand, whose eyes held something other than the dull surrender the state demanded, the natural leader, the man who could, on some future night, become the spark. That was the target. By killing these men, Sparta was pruning the Helot population of its best, cutting down the leaders before they had even understood themselves to be leaders. This was social control at its finest and its most vicious grain. Every Helot with the courage to raise his voice, the pull to gather others around him, the strength to lift a weapon, was quietly erased one at a time in the dark before he could ever act. The Krypteia was a slow war, fought not against an army, but against the idea of hope. And here is the paradox at the center of the Spartan soul. The whole world knew Sparta for the phalanx. The hoplite locked shield to shield with the men beside him, a single wall of bronze that did not break, that did not flinch, that lived and died as one body. The image was seared into Greek memory at Thermopylae in 480 BC, where Leonidas and his 300 held the pass against the Persian host and died in their ranks. Herodotus tells us that when a local man warned them the Persian arrows would blot out the sun, the Spartan Dianics only shrugged and said then they would fight in the shade. That was the Sparta the world was meant to see. Men who joked in the face of death and never left the line. The phalanx was the highest form of trust a man could give another. Each soldier's life hung on the man to his left and the man to his right. No one fought alone. This was the Spartan ideal. Honorable, face to face, two lines of men crashing into each other in the open under the sun, and the braver line winning. Yet to make that soldier, the state first turned him into his own opposite. The man who would one day die rather than leave his place in the line was first sent to learn how to open a stranger's throat from behind in the dark. The warrior, whose whole creed was collective discipline, was cast into total solitude to be tempered. The hero of open battle was first trained as a secret killer of unarmed men. The same Dionysius who joked at Thermopylae had, as a boy, most likely lain in a Laconian thicket with a dagger, waiting for a farmer to walk home. The shade he fought in at the pass was first learned in the dark of the fields. The Krypteia and the phalanx were two faces of one coin. One face was the honor and order Sparta held up for the world to admire. The other was the machinery of terror running underneath it, the thing that made the whole society possible in the first place. The flawless discipline men praised on the battlefield was bought with the pitiless work done in the fields at home, in the dark, with a hidden blade. The 300 could stand at Thermopylae precisely because 35,000 Helots at their backs had been taught, generation by generation, that resistance meant a knife in the night. If the Krypteia was the quiet murder of individuals, what happened when Sparta decided it needed to kill on a larger scale? What did this machine look like when it was fed an entire crowd at once? Thucydides, the Athenian who lived through the Peloponnesian War and wrote it down without softening anything, gives us the answer in one account that is hard to shake off. It happened around 424 BC, in the 10th year of the war, when Sparta was frightened by its own slaves as never before. An Athenian force had seized Pylos on the Messenian coast, planted itself on Helot soil, and become a magnet for runaways. Every night more Helots slipped away to the enemy. Sparta could feel the ground shifting under its feet. So the state made the Helots an offer that had never been made before. Any Helot who had shown himself brave in Sparta's service would be given his freedom. After all those generations bound to the soil, a way out, a chance to become a man in the eyes of the state that had ground his family into the dirt. Around 2,000 came forward. The masters themselves picked them, choosing the ones who had fought best, the boldest, the most deserving. And Sparta staged a ceremony worthy of the moment. These 2,000 men were crowned with garlands, the mark of the newly freed. They were led in a procession through the city, past the temples, a public announcement to gods and men that these were slaves no longer. Picture that walk. 2,000 men who had spent their lives being beaten on schedule and reminded daily of what they were, now wearing wreaths on their heads, walking free through the heart of Sparta. Somewhere their wives and children stood watching. They must have believed the impossible had finally happened. They must have believed courage had bought them a place in the world. Then they were gone. Thucydides writes it with a flatness that lands harder than any scream. He says the men disappeared, and that no one ever knew how each of them had been killed. All 2,000, murdered by the state they had just bled for. And Thucydides names the reason plainly. Sparta believed the very ones who came forward first, the proudest, would be the first to turn on their masters. The garlands, the procession, the temples, all of it a lure built precisely to draw the dangerous ones into the open. This was the Krypteia in its fullest form. not the trimming of a few dangerous shoots, but the clearing of a whole field of hope in a single stroke. And the message written in those 2,000 deaths could not be plainer. There is no way out. Service will not save you. Bravery will not save you. Bravery only marks you for the knife. There is the master, and there is the slave, and the state will break any promise and commit any horror to keep it exactly that way. We do not know the method. Thucydides, who chased down the truth of everything else in his war, could not learn it, and that silence is its own kind of evidence. It means it was done quietly, in small groups, in the dark, by men trained since boyhood to leave no witness and no trace. It means the Krypteia, or something exactly like it, swallowed 2,000 men and closed over them without a ripple. There is a grim echo of this in the earlier revolt as well, when the Helots, who held Mount Taygetus for 10 years, finally surrendered. The Spartans let them leave under truce, but only on one condition, Thucydides tells us. If any of them ever set foot in the Peloponnese again, he would be seized and made a slave once more. Even in mercy, Sparta could not let a free Messenian walk its land. Athens took those exiles in and settled them at Naupactus, on the northern shore of the Corinthian Gulf, where they nursed their hatred for 2 generations and waited. To grasp how a society could plan and carry out a betrayal like that, to see the whole structure of fear and reasoning that held this system upright, you have to go back to the sources themselves. The ancient texts are not dry records. They are windows into a moral world that ran on rules we can barely stand to look at. The book that formed the backbone of this entire investigation is a work of dark and thorough research, an archive of exactly the terror we have been tracing. Owning it is not just adding a title to a shelf, it is holding the evidence in your own hands. You can find it right now through the View Products button on your screen. It was our map through this darkness, and while you are there, look through the rest of what we have gathered. We have put together a collection of relics and dark memorabilia made to carry the shadow of the past into your own home. Do not only watch history, open the shop shelf now and hold a piece of it. The killing of the 2,000 was not a moment of shame in Spartan eyes. It was a solution, cold but logical by the terrible logic the city lived by. The problem was never that these men were disloyal. The problem was that they were the most loyal, the bravest, the most capable, and in Sparta, that was precisely what got a Helot killed, because a man brave enough to fight for his master is a man brave enough to turn and fight against him. By stepping forward, by shining, these 2,000 had marked themselves. They had shown they carried the exact qualities the Krypteia existed to hunt down and destroy. They had passed a test that had death waiting at the far end of it. The same logic surfaces again a century later in one of the ugliest lines the Greeks ever recorded about themselves. Around 369 BC, when a Theban army under Epaminondas finally smashed into Laconia and freed Messenia forever, the Spartans, in their desperation, offered freedom to any Helot who would take up a shield and defend the city. Xenophon, who lived among the Spartans and wrote their history, says 6,000 came forward at once, so many that the Spartans grew frightened of the army of former slaves they had just armed inside their own gates. They had spent centuries murdering the strong ones, precisely so this moment could never arrive. And now it had arrived anyway. The men of Naupactus came home. Epaminondas built them a new capital on the slopes of Ithome, ringed by walls so thick that travelers centuries later stopped to marvel at them, and the Messenians walked free on their own soil for the first time in 300 years. Sparta had built a monster in its own cellar, a system of permanent, unspoken war, always running, always hungry. But a monster has to be fed, and the Spartans were about to learn that this one's appetite had no bottom. It would not stop with the Helots in the fields. It would not stop with the 2,000 in their garlands. Sooner than they thought, it would lift its head, turn slowly toward the men who had made it, toward the kings and the citizens who thought themselves its masters, and begin to feed on Sparta itself. The system of terror was meant to be a wall, a shield between Sparta and the fear that never left it. It was neither. It was poison, and Sparta drank it daily for 300 years. Every law written to pin the Helots down, every boy broken open in the Agoge, every throat cut in the dark by a boy with a hidden knife, each one was another swallow from a cup that was rotting Sparta from the inside. The thing they were certain made them strong was the exact thing killing them, and they never saw it, because they were looking in the wrong direction the entire time. The poison worked first on their nerve, a state that must watch its slaves every hour of every day, cannot look outward with any confidence. Sparta became a jailer, and a jailer cannot wander far from the cells. Every possible campaign, every alliance, every chance to reach out and take more of the world came weighted with one dread. Send the army to Ionia, send it to Sicily, and what rises behind it in the empty fields of Laconia. You can watch that fear paralyze them in real time. When the Persian threat loomed and the Greek cities begged Sparta to march north, the Spartans dragged their feet, held up by a festival, the Carneia, and by their terror of leaving home undermanned. When they finally sent Leonidas to Thermopylae in 480 BC, they sent him with only 300, and Herodotus tells us it was because the Carneia was still running and the main army stayed behind. The city that Greece looked to for salvation could spare 300 men, because the rest had to stay and guard the slaves. So Sparta hesitated. It flinched from risk. It moved slow when speed would have won it an empire. While Athens threw ships across the Aegean and stitched together a sea of subject cities, Sparta kept glancing over its shoulder at the wheat fields, waiting for the smoke. The finest army in Greece was chained to the ground it stood on. It could crush any enemy it could reach, and it could barely leave home. The second working of the poison was quieter and worse. It thinned the blood of Sparta itself. The whole system was a filter, a machine designed to press out one product, the Spartiate, the full citizen and perfect soldier. But the filter was set too fine, and it began to grind down the very men it was built to make. Boys died in the Agoge. Men died in the endless wars. And then there was the trap hidden inside their own law. To be a full Spartan, a man had to hold a plot of land, a kleros, and out of its harvest pay his monthly share into the common mess, the syssitia. Plutarch preserves what that share was. Each man owed the mess a bushel of barley meal, 8 measures of wine, cheese, figs, and a small sum of money for meat and fish every month. Miss the payment through debt or the loss of your land, and you fell. You and your sons were cast down among the inferiors, the hypomyones, the men who had once been Spartans and were Spartans no longer. There was no climbing back. Over the generations, the land drifted into fewer and fewer hands. Aristotle, studying the wreckage later, put his finger on the wound. In his day, he wrote, the women of Sparta held 2/5 of all the land in the country, because heiresses inherited freely and dowries ran huge. Wealth pooled among a shrinking circle of families. More and more men slipped below the line and vanished from the citizen rolls. The machine built to breed a master race was eating its own young year after year, and the numbers tell the whole grim story. Aristotle names it plainly. He says the country could have supported 1,500 cavalry and 30,000 hoplites, and yet the whole number of Spartiates had sunk below 1,000. The state, he writes, was ruined by lack of men, oliganthropia, and could not survive a single blow. There was even a plot that showed how deep the cracks ran. Around 399 BC, Xenophon records the conspiracy of Cynodon, a young man of ability who had been shut out of full citizenship. When the authorities questioned him, they asked why he wanted to bring down the state. His answer was that he wished to be inferior to no man in Sparta. He had planned to arm the inferiors, the Helots, and the Perioikoi, and Xenophon says that whenever these groups spoke of the Spartiates, none of them could hide that they would gladly eat them raw. The Ephors had Cynodon seized, marched out of the city, tortured to name his fellows, and killed. The hatred was not only in the fields, it was inside the walls, wearing the faces of men Sparta had thrown away. At the height of the Persian Wars, Sparta may have counted 8,000 full citizens. By the 4th century BC, that count had caved in. On the eve of the day that would end them, Sparta could put fewer than 1,500 true Spartiates in the field, an officer class with almost no army left beneath it, a tiny elite drifting toward extinction, so busy watching its slaves that it never once looked at the empty seats filling up in its own mess halls. The reckoning came on a flat, dusty plain in Boeotia in the summer of 321 BC. The place was called Leuctra. The Spartan army marched out under one of its kings, Cleombrotus, to face the men of Thebes. Bad omens trailed them the whole way. Xenophon, who lived through these years and wrote them down, records that the Spartans themselves half expected disaster, and that Cleombrotus held a council in the field over whether to fight at all. His officers pushed him forward. Some, Xenophon says, feared that if he backed away, he would be accused of going soft on Thebes. A king marched into the worst defeat in Spartan history, partly because he was afraid of what men would whisper about him. The Spartans were not worried about the fight itself. They were the masters of the land battle, their phalanx unbeaten head-to-head for as long as anyone alive could remember. They lined up the old way, their best men, the Spartiates themselves, holding the place of honor on the right, drawn 12 shields deep. They expected the Thebans to line up the same, and they expected the usual grinding contest of shove and stab, a test of nerve and endurance they had never lost. They did not know the man across the field from them. The Theban commander was Epaminondas. Beside him stood Pelopidas, who led the sacred band, 300 picked Theban warriors, an elite bound to each other and trained to die rather than break. Epaminondas looked at the Spartan line and did not see a wall of bronze. He saw a rigid thing that could be shattered if you hit it in one place hard enough, and he chose to do what no Greek general did. He threw out the standard formation entirely. He thinned his own center and right until they were barely a screen, and he ordered them to hang back, to advance slow and simply not lose. Then he took every good man he had and the sacred band under Pelopidas and piled them onto his left, straight across from the Spartan elite, not 12 deep, 50 deep, a single dense column of shields and spear points, a battering ram of men, aimed at the heart of Spartan power. Before the lines closed, The cavalry clashed in the open ground between them. The Theban horsemen were sharp and battle-ready. The Spartan cavalry, Xenophon tells us, was poor, made up of the weak and the unwilling, and it broke fast and fell back into its own advancing infantry, throwing the Spartan ranks into confusion before a single hoplite had struck. Cleombrotus saw the strange, lopsided shape of the enemy and had no time to work out what it meant. The horns sounded. On the Theban right, the thin ranks held back and refused to close. On the left, the column of 50 rolled forward, one solid block of humanity, and it did not strike the Spartan line square. It came in at an angle, all the weight of thousands of men driven onto one narrow point. The sound was not two armies meeting. It was a tree trunk splitting down the grain. The front ranks of the Spartan phalanx, the best soldiers in Greece, were smashed flat. The mass behind the Theban front drove through them like a wedge through wood. The formation that was the whole source of Spartan strength came apart into a scatter of frightened, separated men, and for the first time in living memory, Spartans broke and ran. Cleombrotus went down early, dragged back, still breathing by his men, and then dying among them. Around him fell the polemarchs Dinon and Sphodrius, and Sphodrius' son Cleonymus beside his father, and the royal guard. Of 700 Spartiates on the field, 400 died where they stood, or fleeing. There is a detail Xenophon could not hide, and it shows how far the rot had gone. Word of the defeat reached Sparta while a festival, the Gymnopaedia, was underway, and the chorus of men was performing in the heat. The Ephors let the dancing finish. Then they gave the names of the dead to each household, and here is the thing. The families of the men who had died did not mourn. They walked out the next morning, bright-faced and proud. The families of the survivors, the men who had run, stayed home in silence and shame. In Sparta, coming back alive from a lost battle was the disgrace. Agesilaus, the old king, faced a further problem. Spartan law demanded that every man who fled the field be stripped of his rights, the tresants, the tremblers. But after Leuctra there were too many of them, and the city could not afford to lose more citizens. So Agesilaus was asked to rule on it, and he gave one of the coldest lines in Greek history. "Let the laws sleep for a day," he said, "and take effect again tomorrow." The state suspended its own iron code, because enforcing it would have finished the job the Thebans had started. In one afternoon, the myth cracked. The word raced across Greece. Sparta, the state that could not be beaten, had been beaten in open battle by an enemy it despised. And its enemies were already on the move to finish what Leuctra had started. Epaminondas did what no invader had dared in the whole history of the city. In the winter of 370 BC, he led a great army down through the passes into Laconia itself, into the valley the Spartans had held inviolate for centuries. No hostile soldier had walked this ground before. Sparta had never bothered to raise walls around its town, boasting that its men were its walls. Now the smoke of Theban campfires rose within sight of Spartan windows, and the invaders reached the far bank of the Eurotas, close enough to look across the cold winter river at the unwalled city. Inside Sparta there was near panic. Xenophon says the Spartan women, who had never in their lives seen an enemy, could not bear the smoke and the noise. The aging king Agesilaus, half lame from birth, held the town together by nerve alone, refusing to march out and be drawn into a fight on ground of the enemy's choosing. There was even a plot among some of the inferiors and Helots to seize the moment, and the Ephors, Plutarch, and Xenophon both note, had to move quietly to snuff it out, killing conspirators before dawn without trial. The paranoia that had built the whole city was now the only thing keeping it from being torn apart from within, while an army camped across the river. Epaminondas burned and stripped the countryside, but sacking farms was never the point. He had come to tear out the foundation stone of the whole society, and he knew exactly where it lay. He turned west. He led his army up over the passes of Taygetus, the same mountain where the boys of the Krypteia had once lain, in wait with their daggers, and down into Messenia, the stolen homeland of the Helots. And there he did the one thing Sparta had killed for 350 years to prevent. He declared Messenia free. He sent messengers across the sea and across Greece, summoning home every exiled Messenian who could be found, the descendants of the men Athens had settled at Naupactus, families who had kept their language and their grief alive for 3 centuries in foreign towns. They came, Pausanias, who walked these lands and gathered the local memory, says the Messenians returned to their own country after so long that a whole way of speaking, a whole set of customs, had survived intact in exile, waiting for this day. He gathered them together with the Helots still on the land, men and women who had known nothing but bondage, whose grandfathers and great-grandfathers had known nothing else, and he told them they were a people again. He did not hand them a promise and ride away. He gave them walls on the slopes of Mount Taygetus, where their ancestors had made their last stand, and where the last free Messenian king had died over his daughter's grave. They laid out a new capital, Messene. Pausanias records the founding rites in detail. The Thebans sacrificed to Dionysus and Apollo, the Argives to Hera and Zeus, and the Messenians called upon Zeus of Ithome and the heroes of their old kingdom by name, waking 3 centuries of dead. Then, he says, they raised the walls to the sound of flutes playing Argive and Boeotian tunes, working through the night. He saw those walls generations later and stood amazed, calling them stronger than any in Greece, circuits of dressed gray stone with towers and battlements, and much of that stonework still stands on the slope today, tall enough to walk beneath. For the first time in centuries, the sound of Messenian hands building for themselves rang through the valley, not raising a master's barn, raising their own city, stone on stone, to music, with the enemy of their enemies standing guard while they worked. That single stroke ended Sparta. With Messenia gone, Sparta lost close to half its land in a season, and with it, the entire slave population that had fed its economy and given its whole existence a purpose. The warrior class forged in the Agoge, tested in the Krypteia, the men bred and beaten and hollowed out for the one task of holding the Helots down, now had no Helots to hold. They were lords of a stripped and empty kingdom. Their estates lay worthless without the hands that had worked them. The training, the discipline, the dominance, all of it drained away. They became a shell, a war machine with no fuel and nothing to fight for. The terror they had poured out onto others for so long had left them stiff and brittle, unable to bend to a world where their slaves were now free men, armed and living next door with 3 centuries of stored grievance. Sparta hung on for a while yet, shrinking, curdling into a strange museum piece. 2 centuries later, a reforming king, Cleomenes III, tried to save the city by canceling debts and carving the land back up into equal plots to rebuild the citizen body. And for a moment, it flared back to life. But Rome and its allies snuffed it out at Silesia in 222 BC. Later still, Roman tourists came to gawk at the boys being flogged bloody at the altar of Artemis Orthia, paying to watch a ritual that had once meant survival, now a show staged for outsiders in a theater built for the purpose. Plutarch, in his own lifetime, saw boys die under the lash there for the entertainment of the crowd. But the power was gone, and it never came back. Here is the truth Sparta could never let itself see. Its real enemy was never Athens, never Persia, never Thebes. Its enemy was the face that looked back at it from the eyes of every Helot in every field. The fear of that face steered every choice Sparta made. It poisoned the society from the roots, and in the end, it walked Sparta straight to its own grave. The boy on the slopes of Taygetus, gripping his blade in the dark, thought he was a guardian. He believed his secret killing was a hard, necessary gift to his people, a life traded to keep the state alive. He was wrong about all of it. He was not the cure. He was the symptom. The Krypteia was never a show of Spartan strength. It was the plainest confession of Spartan weakness ever made. The same fear that drove that boy up into the hills with a knife was the fear that emptied the mess halls of Spartiates, the fear that held Leonidas back to 300 men, the fear that froze their armies at the border, the fear that left them blind to a man like Epaminondas until his column of 50 was already splitting their line. They built an entire civilization to manufacture the perfect warrior, and they forgot the one thing that mattered. A man who spends his whole life afraid of his own shadow is, in the end, swallowed by the dark he was so certain he could control. And the men they hunted for 3 centuries, the strong ones, the proud ones, the ones with the spark of defiance that marked them for the knife, outlived them all. Messene stood free for the rest of antiquity, its great walls unbroken. Sparta shrank to a name in a guidebook. In the end, the slaves buried the masters. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If you believe these histories need to be told, subscribe to the channel, tap like on this video, and send it to one person who needs to see it. Your support is what keeps this mission alive. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. And the next story is already waiting. The video on your screen right now is your next step down into the past. Click it. Keep going. We will be there in the dark, waiting for you.